I'm Derek Wheatley, and welcome to episode 66 of the Wheatley podcast. Thank you very much to Laura Murphy for coming on last week. We actually had a really great response to Laura's podcast. I think people learned a lot from the IMBAS thing, but also she talked about, if you haven't listened, she talked about the mother and babies homes and her what she wrote about it and the open letter to one Taoiseach. And I think people will kind of, when they hear someone talk about it who's kind of involved with it or had a close family member who's involved with it, I think it kind of stands out a bit more and it's a bit more hard hitting. So I'm really glad that a lot of people listen to Laura's episode, and she's been great actually just putting the stuff out there and that. So thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, I would say the same as every week. If you don't mind, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's growing. I think this is maybe our sixth. Might be wrong. It's our fifth or sixth episode where we're actually going to be on videos. You can watch us on our YouTube channel or listen to us on all the usual spots. The live and joyful thing on Instagram is it's kind of bothering me. It's like I enjoy doing it and all that, but I'm kind of up in the air about doing that, or whether I do that or whether I do the Facebook Live. The good thing about the Facebook Live, I don't have to organize guests, so I can just do it on my own. Like play a song that I'm most likely going to kind of make a mess of, so that's a bit of fun. And then get into a bit of things that are annoying me, but a lot of things kind of this week. I might do one this week. We were just talking off air, myself and Rosie there, about how we got the announcement about how the shops are going to start opening the gym. So that's a really good news, but I'm always a little bit wary about how the impact it would have on people with mental health and trying to get back into society that they may have been out of for about a year. So I would maybe talk about that on my next one, but that's probably enough of me talking. I'm going to introduce my guest. She's the founder and editor of the Historians magazine, and her name is Rosie Maggs. How are you, Rosie?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you for asking. I had a little bit of a freak out there about 20 minutes ago. The electricity went, and I was the phone in my hand. I said, right, I'm going to have to text Rosie and tell her that something's happening. Fortunately, it was just a trip switch. My landlady hit the button on the kettle. Everything went out, but we're back. But anyway, let's get into it, because we've got a lot to cover. Could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please, Rosie?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town called Chepstow, Chepstow's in Wales, but I grew up just outside on the border. I grew up with my mum, my dad, and my brother. We lived in like an old country cottage, so it was quite unique because not many of my friends lived in like a little cottage with a big garden. It was like quite countryside, almost like living on a farm, but not quite.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have the animals, although we did have chickens at one point, which was quite nice. But yeah, so it was just us four. I went to primary school in the village. My secondary school was opposite. Just a pretty normal English upbringing. Where we lived, there wasn't actually many kids living around us, so I literally had to hang out with my brother all the time. So good and bad. We used to fight a lot, but like in a nice way.
Yeah.
And it was always my dream that a family would move in like on the same road as us, but they never did until I left home, and I was like, how typical. Like as soon as I leave, someone my age moved in. I was like, but yeah, I think I just had a pretty standard upbringing just in England, in a nice quiet place. I think it was a bit of a shock to the system when I moved to uni, and it was like loads of clubs and like shops and like everything was in walking distance. I was like, oh my god, like what is this?
Where was uni then?
So I went to uni in Southampton.
Okay.
Which, I mean, I liked uni, but Southampton is it's not my favorite place in the world.
Bit rough? Is it a bit rough, or is it?
Yeah, there's just a lot of problems there. So just like walking home at night with your friends, it would be like you just wouldn't feel quite safe. Even if there was a group of you,
Yeah.
you just always felt a bit like, oh, this is a bit dodgy. And obviously growing up somewhere where I could just walk home on my own pretty much,
Yeah.
where I grew up, and it wouldn't be, I wouldn't feel that scared. So to go to a city and be like, oh, like
Yeah.
it's
Well,
scary.
give us an idea then. So, from where you were living to Southampton, how much of a distance is that roughly?
So I think it was about just under 100 miles, I
Okay,
think.
right,
Maybe around 100 to 150 miles. So
right. You
about
were
2.5 hours maybe.
it's a decent distance away, really. What was the so just give me an idea of the my English geography is based around when I was young and I watched football and I used to be like, oh, Southampton is down in the south coast and then this is up here because that's where Sunderland play, whatever. What county were you born in then?
So I grew up in like Gloucestershire, Monmouthshire kind of way.
Okay,
So in terms of football teams, I guess my two closest teams would be Bristol and Cardiff because it's kind of like in the middle
I
um
see.
between
So
those two. So
it's
yeah.
all right. I mean, it's not the best teams, but it's fine. Like, so Rosie, when did you first become aware of mental health?
So I think like the term mental health, I probably not until like school
Mm.
when you kind of learn about different like like in what's it called, like uh, citizenship or something like
Mm.
that, or and you learn about like different types of mental health and like how to like look out for yourself and stuff. I don't think I've heard of the term like before that. I think maybe I'd heard of like depression and like
Yeah.
kind of the normal ones that people would mention, but like other ones, like maybe like more detail, I wouldn't have known about them. And I guess like a lot of the time it was like, oh, so and so's crazy. Like that's kind of the
Mm.
terminology that's used, or like, oh, so and so's really sad if someone was experiencing that. So I don't think like I was aware like if someone was had a mental health problem, I don't think I necessarily was aware of it because I
Yeah.
wouldn't have known what it was called. And people, obviously, towards children, I think people are very don't want to say what it is, I guess.
Well, yeah, and so it's interesting though that you were at least being told about it in school. You know, that at least it was being brought up in a because I think maybe what the class would have been when I was in school would have been civics, maybe, and then but we didn't talk about mental health at all. Now that was back in the late 90s, so it was very much like you're saying there about someone's crazy. It's even the idea of someone who lives on their own in a street, like just a man who lives on his own, and everybody thinks he's weird or there was always something that was kind of a label kind of put on them. So I kind of like to think that we've moved on a bit from that, and in schools that it is starting to be addressed a bit more, where the normalization of it is, anxiety is a condition that, and here are the signs for it. And it's just like you said, it's the idea of just telling people what they should kind of look out for, I guess.
Yeah, um I think it definitely has moved on even since I
Mm,
was in school. I mean, I stopped school like secondary school in like 2014.
mm.
So yeah, early to like 2000s would have been when I was kind of learning about this kind of stuff. But I do think like since then it has got better as well, because even like at university, like there was an improvement on like them kind of telling us like how to get help and stuff like that, and always getting like emails and like leaflets and stuff like that for like counseling, and just like they're really trying to push it because they know that people won't get the help. So I think that definitely like I have noticed, especially over this last year, like where I'm doing my masters, like there is always something in the emails they send us about like counseling and
Mm.
stuff like that. So I think like especially after this year, I do think schools will really put an emphasis on it because it's been such a bad year for so many people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think there has to be a lot more push on it, and with the stresses that come with college and people doing college over Zoom, it's not quite ideal. So I hope it's kind of addressed a bit more. So we're going to be talking a lot about history. I really wanted to get someone on to talk about history because it was my favorite subject at school, I had a teacher, Lar McGuinness was his name. He passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but he was an incredible teacher, and one of those people that you just listen to talk. It's that kind of a gift that people have, some people have, or they just are very, very easy to listen to. And he's the reason I really got into history. Um, what was it that fascinated you about history? And like, was it a very early thing in your life when you went into maybe secondary school that the interest kind of took hold?
Yeah, so my dad has always been like really into history, especially like military history and like basically he's from Bristol and his family were like in the like ship making business and stuff and like I don't know what you call them, but like not quite the navy, but basically all to do with like the water and the harbor and stuff. So he always
Dockmen, no, no, it's not
yeah,
dockmen.
yeah, it was
It's something
something
like
along those
dockyard men.
lines. Yeah, they were all in that kind of
Okay.
business. So he'd always been interested, so he was always like talking about it. But then when I was in primary school, I had a really good teacher called Mrs. Watkins, and she was teaching us about the Romans. And I remember we went on like a family weekend away to like, it must be like Cornwall or Devon, like somewhere on the coast. And we went into a bookshop, and my dad bought me a book on the Romans. And then I think since then, I just always liked reading about history and like researching it. And then obviously when I got to secondary school, obviously you do a lot more history lessons. So then obviously I took it for GCSE, took it for A level. I didn't actually do my degree in history though, but um,
Okay.
yeah.
Did you do your degree in then?
So I did my degree in film production because my two main interests was like film and history, and I went, oh yeah, I'm going to do film production. And then I got halfway through the degree and thought, don't really want to do film production, but I graduated with film production. So
Congrats. I
um,
think, yeah, like they would be quite high up in my interests. Would be films and history, and I think I mentioned it before. I've learned certain parts of history just through film and the different, like whether it's today's films that are coming out or going right back to the 30s and 40s films where you start learning stuff where you're like, how could that have happened? Like, and then you look it up and you're like, oh no, that was actually happening at the time they were making the film, and that's where this kind of things came from. But I kind of interrupted you there. But what was it you were studying? Did you say in the in history? Is European history
yeah, so at the moment I'm doing my masters in European history. So yeah.
pretty pretty deep stuff in European history, pretty gory. But I guess like if you did start out with the Romans, it kind of you kind of learn a lot of the gory stuff quite early on when it comes to that kind of thing. But so like I mentioned your magazine already, The Historians. Um, when did you decide to start that?
Um, I think it was in like October or November of last year. So like literally at the end of the year. I kind of put like a poll out on my Instagram. I was like,
Okay.
would anyone be interested in reading this? And everyone was like, yeah, I'd love that. So I just on my own just decided just to be like, can everyone submit some articles? Like, it was I'm not saying it was unorganized, but I got a lot more messages than I thought I was going to get. I think I got about, well, the whole of the first edition is 50 pages.
Mm.
So I got about like 50, I don't know, I got a lot of messages. There was at least like 30 articles in there, which I then had to like go through myself and like all that, which I wasn't expecting. I was kind of expecting like 10, and then like everyone started messaging me. Um, and yeah, then I just put it together, released it, and since then I've kind of hired some, not hired because it's like voluntary, but I
Mm.
got some people to get involved and help me with like getting everything together because it was just so much work that I wasn't expecting when I did the first edition.
That's what I was going to actually ask about the work, and I will say you put up on your Instagram page in the last few days. The second edition came out, and it's so beautifully put together. I know you talked about the type, but whoever it is that prints it, it's a really really lovely magazine to kind of look at. And I know there's an online, you can do an online kind of thing, but I love the idea of having the actual page. Look, I read books. I don't kind of read them on Kindle. I like to have the book on my hand, and I think that goes the same when it comes to magazines. And I think with a specialist magazine, you want the best possible product that you can get. A product that you could kind of keep if you buy from, the first edition. You want to be able to keep them all, and it continues to look nice and be held together well. And I kind of thought it looked stunning when you were doing it on the Instagram page. Like I find it, it's to me the idea of thinking to myself, right? I'll get a magazine. I'm going to start a magazine and putting a poll out, and then it's just yourself. Like you're the one taking all the work. The work must have been like fairly. I know you're working with people now, but when all that kind of came in, I imagine myself being quite frantic about it. How are you with that kind of workload? Are you all right under stress and things like that?
Yeah, so when I got all the Instagram messages, I was like, I just kind of left my phone for a bit because I was like, I think it all came in like because I put out a post being like, oh, submit an article. And I think I got probably like 40 messages. I was like, right, I'm gonna deal with that later. I was like, that's like not happening. But because I kind of tried to set it out so that like I wouldn't like I tried to give everyone like a few weeks to get the articles in and then like give myself like 2 weeks to put it together. I did end up like being a bit behind my schedule because I just realized how much work it was. I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to get this done. But I did get it done in the end. But I think the actual like process of getting all the articles in and like going through them and checking for like spelling mistakes and all the like little tiny bits was actually
Mm.
more work than actually putting the document together because I use InDesign like all the time at work and like I'm just really used to it. So all I really had to do was just set up the document and then like paste the articles in pretty much. Like it's a little bit more complex than that, but
Mm.
pretty much like just putting it into the spaces is kind of how I've set it up so that it's easy for me. So like that was the easy part. It was just the rest of it that was the hard part.
Yeah, like again, it's when when you talk to someone who doesn't know what it is that you would need to do to put those, like you say, and putting the pieces on the paper. To you, that's very easy, but to me, that's going to take hours to kind of sort it all out. I just think of the kind of pressure that you might feel under that kind of strain, especially if you're working as well and you're studying and things like that. Um, the idea of getting the people on board to help you with the articles obviously was one thing, and it's all voluntary, like you say. It's clearly enthusiasts, for history that you've kind of teamed up with.
Yeah, so everyone who's like been a part of it have Instagram accounts and stuff about history. So they want to put like they just have a passion for it as well. So like that's why they were interested. But like when I even did the call out to be like, oh, can someone help me do like editing of the articles and like choosing articles? Because obviously when you get so many submissions for the articles, you kind of need to have someone help you be
Mm.
like, oh, that's a good one. Oh, that one wouldn't work for this edition, but next time. Um, but I literally got so many responses to that as well. I had to say no to a lot of people because otherwise I'd love to say yes to everyone, but I would have had a team of like 100 people and that just wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, that's too much. That's too much. Do you know what I'm going to do now, Rosie? Actually, I'll get the advert in, and then we can get back into it. Let's see how I get on this week. Fusion Training Center, Monksland, Athlone. A place to train in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. Very important to note that on the 10th of May, outside classes will be allowed to start. So, CrossFitters will be able to start training again in the car park. Um, I think it's the 7th of June. I might be off by a couple of days, but I think it's the 7th of June when the inside stuff can start again. So the CrossFitters can go back inside and avoid the rain. But it's brilliant for the gym. It's brilliant for Martin Hickey, my coach, who has waited a long time to open the gym back up again. And I know he's very much looking forward to it, and as we all are, to get back in there and do a bit of training, a bit of working out. Your podcast, Rosie, is the Roaring Twenties podcast. What is it about the 20s that appeals to you?
Um, I just really love the like era. I think we've had such a like we've been sold it in so many films and
Mm,
books and stuff, and I just think it's just such a great like time period to actually look at, because we kind of have this image of like gangsters and like dancing and jazz music, but I kind of wanted to look into more of like, was it actually like that? Because
mm,
I know from doing like historical research and like reading books that really it probably wasn't how we think it
mm.
is.
I love about history, and it's you could kind of draw a line towards music and films that everybody has kind of a genre that they like in music. And in history, people seem to have specialist subjects that they really, really kind of can devote themselves to, and tell us, like you say, tell us exactly what happened rather than what we've been kind of spoon fed about what happened. Because obviously, there's not many people around from the 20s who can talk to us and tell us about what happened. I'm fascinated by American history, and particularly kind of modern, I guess you'd call it American history in the last maybe 100 years or so. Um, can you tell, because this is kind of a kind of a subgenre, if you will, about in the 20s there was a phenomenon that were flappers were a type of people. Could you tell us what flappers are?
Yeah, so they're basically, if you've ever watched anything based in the 20s, it's those girls with like the kind of, I don't know what it's called, like um the nice like kind of shift dresses, and a lot of them have like tassels
Mm,
on, and they kind of like when they dance it like moves with them, and they've got like kind of the short bob and like the headband, and smoking the long cigarette. They like drinking, they like jazz music, they like going to clubs. They are also promiscuous, and they're just kind of like the modern woman
mm.
in the 20s. But yeah, there's just this image of them that they were all really wild and you know drank to all hours of the day and partied every day and all that kind of thing. So I think if you ever watch anything, like I think The Great Gatsby,
Mm.
there's a lot of flappers in The Great Gatsby. Yeah.
The What's fascinating about the flappers to me was the rebellion, amongst them. The idea that women were supposed to be a certain way back then in the 20s, and they went against everything that they were kind of, told that they were supposed to be. And like you said, they were promiscuous, which was kind of not just frowned upon, way more than frowned upon. Out drinking, out in nightclubs, for the time, maybe scandalously dressed. But there's something, I don't know, there's something kind of heroic to me about the idea that they were going against everything that they were not supposed to be doing. They had this, you were wearing one on a podcast, your own podcast, I should say, last week. What is the thing that's like on the head that comes down on the forehead? There's kind of like is that a kind of a jewel or something?
Yeah, so the one I had just like was a jewel, but I just noticed like in a lot of the films and stuff, they all have like kind of, especially the rich like
Mm.
flappers have like kind of like crystal headbands and stuff like that. I think it was just a fashion thing at the time, like just look nice.
I think it looks class. It was funny when I saw the picture of your podcast when you put it out, and I was kind of like, everybody will know once they see it. They'll be like, "Oh, of course, I'm probably not describing it very well. I'll be honest, because fashion has escaped me my whole life. I'll be fair. I'll be honest. So, but the flappers fashion is particularly cool. I think it is anyway. And if anybody wants to kind of look up, you will see in Hollywood films from the 20s and 30s, and beyond, obviously, but it's especially in 20s and 30s, they feature the kind of the characters that is a flapper. And almost there's some films where they're trying, or the man in it is trying to tame the flapper, and that seems to be like a recurring thing. If they go the other way, uh, it's normally they're trying to save them because they're drinking too much and the devil has a hold of them, or whatever way they want to put it. So it's fascinating to me. Um, So when you were researching, then prohibition is another thing that's kind of mad when you think back on it. Was there anything that you learned that you didn't kind of already know about prohibition when you were researching?
Yeah, there was quite a few things actually. I guess as much as I did kind of study prohibition at school, but I
Yeah.
don't really remember much about it. All I remember is that they weren't allowed to drink alcohol. That's all I knew. But I found out like also it was a ban on gambling as well.
Mm.
It wasn't just alcohol, which I didn't know. Um, and I also found out like some methods that they use to kind of get around. Um, so apparently they used to have these like blocks of like grapes. Like I think they were like must have been like cooked grapes or something. And it said on the box, don't leave these in like a certain temperature, otherwise it will turn into wine. Almost basically selling it like this will turn into wine.
Yeah.
Buy it.
Yeah, like I love that. Like, don't listen, don't do it, lads. But it's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge thing. Um, if people haven't kind of copped onto my references to history in the 20th century, it is all film based. I get that. Prohibition is just it's a crazy idea because you did mention it wasn't just drink; it was gambling. There was also a kind of a code on films when films started coming out in I think it was post 1929. I might be wrong with the exact date, but the laws on films, even showing a bit of bare ankle was not a good thing, but they even tightened it up even further. And they turned this into almost like they were chasing after film directors and stuff, not to show anything, not to any bad language, even, saying God was a really bad thing. And it was a crackdown on pretty much anything that was joyous in the in the world seemed to be crack. It's bizarre to me. The prohibition thing is just. I try to think of it in relation to just if it happened now, whether over in England where you are, over here in Ireland, like how they could even try going about doing it without kind of an instant mob reaction. Did you during your research on it? How was it kind of brought down? Do you know how it was kind of they kind of got rid of it?
Um, yeah, so obviously the prohibition actually did last for 10 years, or I think actually it was a little bit longer than 10 years, which is a really long time. But one of the reasons that they actually repealed the prohibition was because obviously in 1929 there was the Wall Street crash and the whole country went into a massive depression and there was no money and people couldn't get jobs. And then the government realized like, oh, we're not getting any money from all this illegal alcohol that's being sold. Why don't we make it legal and then we can get all the taxes back on it? So I think it was in 30, it was either 31 or 33, I've forgotten my dates, but basically they just went, oh, we need the taxes. So they repealed it and started to try and make money off it. But the thing is, after um, the depression hit, people going to clubs and like all that kind of thing and going out drinking actually did decline. So the 20s was really the golden age for like the clubs and the jazz music and performers. When you get to like the 30s, people aren't as interested in it. I think
Mm.
maybe the illegal aspect made people more interested, maybe.
That could be very could be it. All right. Talking about legal aspects, we've got to kind of touch on gangsters because of the fact that people are. I know of a couple of friends who are obsessed with the whole gangster idea. Not they don't want to be gangsters. Let me just put it out there, but they do have this notion of the kind of gangsters back then, like Dillinger and those kind of Bonnie and Clyde. They 20s, I think they were 30s maybe, but the gangster kind of I guess it bred from things like, all those nightclubs being around, all that behavior that was kind of frowned upon at the time. But prohibition was another reason, I guess, that the gangsters rolled into town. What did you learn about the gangsters thing? Because like the three things we kind of covered seem to kind of lead in together. They're kind of all part of it.
Yeah, so obviously without prohibition, I don't think there would have been this massive
Mm.
gangster underground scene. Because obviously selling, making, and transporting alcohol was illegal, um, which is the three things that the gangsters specialized in. And obviously we've heard of like the famous ones like Al Capone. He was um, big in Chicago, so he had a lot of clubs. He transported alcohol, he created alcohol, and sold it. But obviously, for him, he paid off all the police officers. So he was completely fine. And I think Al Capone is the one that we all. He's like the stereotypical gangster.
Mm.
So whenever you watch a gangster film and they're wearing like a pinstripe suit or they have like a scar on their face or anything and they have like a kind of thick American accent, it's all based off Al Capone because he was the most notorious of the time. But what you see from the prohibition is there was just so many gangsters because so many people wanted to go to speakeasies and drink and have a good time. Like there was just loads of gangsters and like most of the time they didn't get caught. So a few of them, like after prohibition was repealed, one of them actually was one of the founders of Las Vegas as a like
Mm.
the like the strip of all the bars. So he founded that afterwards, even though for 10 years before that he was a massive criminal. So it's really interesting.
Is that's not Bugsy Siegel, is it? Siegel.
um
Was he part of that? Maybe.
yeah, I can't remember the name, but I think he might have been one of the people that was part of that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's it. You know what you talk about Al Capone, and we do like talk about these top level gangsters. You know, like where Capone and Dillinger and all these guys who are what we've heard about, I guess. But there must have been a huge amount of medium time and then small time gangsters as well, because the idea that Al Capone didn't get his hands dirty, and he that had to kind of bleed down into somebody else, and then you've kind of got the guys just walking around the streets, just cutting, like you said, a scar on the face, are just cutting people in the face to get their money. The idea of Chicago in the 20s kind of terrifies me. Is that like would okay? I'll put it this way: like if I asked you, do you want to go back to the 20s for a week? Would you go back just for luck? Would it freak you out a bit? I'm talking about one of the cities now.
um I mean, I guess I'd like to go back just to see what it's like, but also, yeah, like you said, Chicago would not have been the place to be. Like there was just like it would have been scary. I don't
Yeah.
think it would have been all fun and games, and because you would have known who the gangsters were and who not to cross and stuff. So
That's true. Yeah, that actually is true, because if we do go back, we can kind of know where to go and where not to go, and stay away from certain people. But it must have been a crazy time, and like they call it the Roaring Twenties for a reason, So I can only imagine what it was like. I would not go back for just to clear that up. But you're doing your master's dissertation on female criminals in the early 20th century. Why that subject?
yeah, so I mean, when I started my masters, I thought that I was going to do my dissertation on something like the Holocaust or like World War II or something. And then I did a module on early modern London and I just like really enjoyed it. And I was like, oh, I want to do my dissertation on something to do with London. And then I kind of was like, oh, I don't know what else I like. And then I kind of found some like books about criminals and I was like, oh, I could do female criminals in London because there's loads of like resources for it. So yeah, I just found some like really interesting stuff and I just thought it would be a really great topic to explore because I feel like it's not something that we actually really know much
Mm.
about. We always know about male criminals and stuff like that, but we don't actually know how like females are treated in the like justice system. So I thought it would be interesting to look at.
Why do you think we don't hear as much about female criminals from back then?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think there was this like opinion of women that they were like precious and they couldn't do anything wrong. And I think when I've been looking through like court proceedings and stuff, even if the woman is found guilty of the crime, she still either gets registered like criminally insane, or the church comes and helps her and lets her off or something like that. Whereas like when you look at the male court records, if the man has murdered someone, they'll get sent to death straight away. Like no questions asked really. Whereas the woman, they'll really try and find a reason not to send them to death and not to find them guilty.
I know this isn't the early 20th century, but we just spoke before we come on, and I was trying to think over the last little while of female criminals, and it was always that idea of Myra Hindley, Ian Brady, Rosemary West, Fred West, Bonnie and Clyde. It always seemed to be involved. Now, I don't know if this is because we just have more resources like YouTube channels, or people who are into true crime and things like that, and there's an explosion in that we're hearing more and more about female criminals and murderers or even serial killers. But it's only seems to be in the last 40 years, like in that time frame. So I think that's going to be a fascinating thing to a subject to look at, to go back all the way back there. And I know you're kind of in the middle of it at the moment. Like, what kind of when we talk about crime, what kind of crimes are you looking at? Like serious crimes, or is there a little bit in between?
Yeah, so I'm mainly looking at serious crimes
Mm.
because all the Old Bailey records are stored online. So out of just easiness, because we're in the middle of coronavirus, I thought I'll stick to like serious, because some of the like lower down courts don't have all their records together.
Mm.
So most of the crimes I'm looking at which counted as like serious is like abortion, or like helping with abortion. So like
Mm.
a doctor could be tried alongside the woman on the same level, or like if you were a friend and you took them to the abortion or whatever.
Yeah.
um Infanticide, so
Yeah.
killing a child, or and because basically back then you had to have proof that you'd planned for the baby. So if you, for some reason, if you had like a little baby grow in your house, they'd say, oh, then it's accidental death. But if you'd hidden it and then the baby died, you pretty much get found guilty. And also some people did obviously kill babies as well.
Mm.
It was just more common back then. Obviously like murder. Trying to think of what other serious crimes, like
Yeah. Well.
I guess theft.
Yeah. But that they'd be kind of the main ones. Well, yeah. The infanticide. I think I'm pronouncing it right. I don't know. It's hard to know, but people know what we mean. I guess when it comes to something like that, the immediate idea back then is that the mother must be crazy, because how could they do something like that? Again, touching on mental health, it wasn't exactly, a major thing back then. Nobody talked about it. It was hidden away. And if somebody was considered crazy, if you want to use the term, they were put in an asylum, and that was it. So the kind of idea that that a mother would kill a baby, they didn't really research why it could happen. There was more, well, that person's crazy. They've got to go in into an asylum, and that's that. So again, it kind of goes back into that, mental health thing, where it was just kind of cast aside. Do you know what would be? This isn't me trying to strong arm you into writing an edition on in your magazine. But have you ever thought about, or would you ever think about doing something like a history of mental health in society? Because it's fascinating subject to me. Just in the last few years since I've been affected, I read a biography about the guy who invented the lobotomy, and how it went from putting an ice pick into someone's frontal lobe to ECT now, where people are in a setting where it's more comfortable, and they're given some electric current into their frontal lobe. So would that be something that would interest you in the future?
Yeah, definitely. If someone was interested in writing about it,
Mm.
then we I'd definitely be interested in featuring it in the magazine. I like having a big range of like different topics. So I like the idea of having something that's different to what we've had in the magazine before.
Yeah, and it's so, it's so important that we, like, obviously that we learn from the past, like that goes without saying. But I don't know if we are as clued in as we should be to what went on in the past. The kind of the horrors of how people were treated who did have mental illnesses, and kind of forgotten about or hidden away, even, out of embarrassment or shame. And the techniques that were used were horrendous. It goes without saying, right up to what they are now. So I just think, like, there's a huge amount of stuff that could be covered, and I don't remember seeing it all in one place before. It's I've seen bits and pieces through books and kind of things online, and I just think it's a really interesting subject. But like I've said, I'm not trying to strong arm you to write an edition on it, but like maybe down the line we'll see. But talking about an edition that you did one on forgotten women in history. Why was that such an important thing for you to write about?
Yeah, so when we were kind of discussing topics, it was around the time of Women's History Month, and we were like, what should we do? And then someone said forgotten women of history, and I was like, yeah, that would be a really good idea, because there's so many like stories that no one's heard about, or not many people have heard about. And I feel like even me as like a female, I think we do look at history from the man's perspective. Even like I've been interested in loads of stuff, and I just think, well, like they never even mention women, but yet
Mm.
we're all still interested in it. And I thought it would actually be really nice to like do something that is a bit different, and just kind of unearth some stories that, well, I mean, I haven't heard of most of the ones that were written, so I've learned something anyway.
Who were kind of, obviously you covered a few, who were the fascinating, one or two fascinating people that you didn't know about and you've learned about?
Yeah, so there was one article that was written about a woman called Una Marson.
Okay.
And she was like the first black uh, woman to like work with the BBC.
Oh,
Um, and she was kind of like a poetry and stuff like that. And yeah, she was like, I think she was Jamaican. Um, and she like did poems on the BBC and stuff like that. And like wrote articles and stuff, which like no one else had done in that was black
yeah.
before. So it was really interesting to read about her.
Yeah, like that's, breaking barriers again, especially the BBC, which is kind of very institutionalized. I suppose it probably still is, but for as you say, for a black woman to get in there and be able to kind of produce stuff out of it is pretty it's pretty amazing. And even like obviously you cover a broad range of history, and even going back as far as the Romans and things like that. And like you said, you just hear about the men all the time, like with the kings. I know obviously you hear about the queens, but that's about it when it comes to women back in that kind of period. If you're talking about Britain, it's only really the kind of queens, like. And did you discover any kind of kind of people had fell about, what's this expression? Fell by the wayside. That's the expression from back when you were uh first interested in history, all the way back to, so you talk about the Romans. Maybe you don't have to go that far back now.
Yeah, so I think for this edition we did get a lot more like modern history, and like as you said, queens was like really like something that people were interested in. But I'd say like from like the Tudors and like
Mm.
back, I guess that's the furthest back that we kind of got. um like there was an article about like some of the forgotten women of like the Wars of the Roses. So obviously we know about some of the main women, like the queens at the time. But someone wrote about the kind of other women that were important in helping with like the war, but didn't ever get a mention,
Yeah.
which I found quite interesting, because I know a little bit about the War of the Roses, but not like a huge amount, and definitely nothing about women. So I found that one really interesting.
There, have you noticed recently there seems to be a dip back into history when it comes to World War II even, and the effort that was made at home when you talk about Britain, which seemed to be brushed over at the time as something that was expected of women because the men were out fighting or whatever. Then we're kind of they're kind of reeling backwards in history. I'm sure this is not just Britain, by the way. I'm obviously talking about Britain because I'm speaking to you, but I'm sure goes into the other countries involved in the war. There seems to be a kind of an acceptance that what was going on at home was just as tough and just as important, but we kind of forgot about that because we thought the lads were out there shooting, so that was it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think over the past few years, there's definitely been some like films and like TV series maybe that have kind of shed a light on some of these women because obviously we've got like kind of, is it called The Imitation Game with
Yeah,
that kind of showed that there was women working in that really hard environment in the like code breaking, which would have been, it's not just them sat at a desk all day. It
yeah.
was pretty hard work.
It was tough, I'd say. I mean, you would need a specialist kind of brain to deal with it. I would not have been able to cope with that kind of thing. But I think it's only a great thing that this is being highlighted by not just by yourself, by your magazine, by the BBC, whoever. It doesn't really matter where it's coming from. That, but just as long as it's kind of coming out where, in International Women's Month, that the idea that we are celebrating those people that are kind of forgotten rather than just the women that we kind of know and just holding them up all the time because there's so much more underneath. I wanted to ask you because we talked just a bit before we came on about colonialism and my mate Josh, I've mentioned him numerous times in this podcast. Everybody knows him by now, even though they haven't met him. Uh, he's from the Wirral, and when he moved to Ireland maybe 5 years ago, he started to look up a bit of the history of Ireland and about how obviously everybody knows that it was colonized by England, but or by Britain, I should say. Um, he wasn't taught a lot about it in school, which is interesting enough to me. Um, Obviously, the fact that you went on beyond school into history in university, um, what was the difference in school and university when you learned about colonialism when in regards to Britain?
Yeah, so at school we didn't really learn anything about Ireland, I don't think. I can't recall learning about anything. So I'm gonna go with that we didn't learn
Okay.
anything. Oh, actually no, we did learn one tiny bit
Oh,
about, but it was in relation to, it was Oliver Cromwell and all the horrible things that he did.
yeah, we love
That's the
him over
only,
here.
yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, that's the only time we ever touched on Ireland in school. So we didn't learn
Yeah,
anything. Obviously, I'm studying European history. I do think like there is this tendency not to mention Ireland as much as other countries. So like we'll talk about Britain having colonies, and it'll be
mm,
like India and African countries, and then it'll be like, oh, and Ireland. Like, because I feel
right.
like there's just this shame from like the English perspective that they colonized Ireland.
Is it because?
Um,
Do you think it's because? Well, not solely because of this, but because it's like just next door there. It's almost like the elephant in the room.
Yeah, I think it's the same with like Scotland and stuff as well.
Mm,
We're kind of just like, oh yeah, that's part of us. Like we'll just pretend that it's always been there. But I
mm,
think like we did learn a little, we have touched on Ireland like in university a bit as kind of just like a side note.
yeah.
But yeah, like obviously they were a colony, and when we're talking about colonization and stuff of the other countries, we have to remember like it happened the same to Ireland as it did to India, as it did to Africa, and I think just all the time that's forgotten. But in my like university class, like we have an Irish girl, and she literally is always like, what about Ireland? Like, oh, can we just mention about like the potato famine and how like
Mm,
Britain, like England, like led to that, and like always bring up points when like if we're talking about violence in like India or something, she'll be like, well, yeah, but they did that in Ireland too. So it's quite interesting to see her perspective, because she's obviously been brought up in an Irish school and has this has the knowledge of what happened.
Yeah. I find it interesting. I find the people my age or younger that hold it. I'm not saying they should forget history, obviously, but when they hold it over people still. And I was in the presence of my very good friend Josh, and there was a couple of other lads, and there was a Brazilian there, and one of the lads was saying to him like about, Chucky or Law, like, which is, our day will come in Irish, and it's about to do with Ulster and Northern Ireland and all this stuff, the whole thing. And what really pissed me off about that was that he was projecting that onto a Brazilian who's only been in the country himself maybe 2 or 3 years. Why put that on? Why give that impression that we're against somebody when someone's just sitting right there, and if he heard you, you know, he'd speak to you about it. It's not like. So I understand the whole thing. I get that, but I don't like that kind of thing of trying to keep spreading it and spreading it where there's a level of dislike or discontent. It's always probably going to be there because of the border and the up in the north and that, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way things work. But yeah, like I just found it kind of fascinating, and even more fascinating hearing from you now, Rosie, about the idea of yeah, like we talk about India, and but we don't really talk about Ireland because, but look, it could be the fact that it's just close by, but the whole idea, and obviously we're talking about Britain with you, but with European history in general, when you talk about Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, the Dutch, all colonized places, and it's a very kind of damning, indictment of the way the Europeans thought at the time, that they were willing to go to other countries and take what they wanted, and then kind of when they were done with it, they could head off then and give out about it when the people from that country followed them home. It's a weird history. But look, I didn't want to put you on the spot with that. That's why I brought it up beforehand, and it was just out of curiosity, really. There was another thing I wanted to touch on because you did send me this, and you brought up chocolate, and look, everybody loves chocolate, I think, But I don't need you to go through the whole history of chocolate because that's probably very long. But you mentioned the Aztecs, okay? Now, what's the story with how did that come about?
Yeah, so obviously the cocoa bean was grown in kind of like what we now call like Mexico,
Mm.
like South America basically. And the Aztecs had their own form of like hot chocolate, which was like a really like sacred thing to them. So they'd use it in like marriage ceremonies, like sacrifice, like anything like religious, they would normally have like this form of hot chocolate, which was kind of like, I think it was like a cold chili, it had like chili, vanilla and cocoa
Oh,
beans, and it was kind of like ground together. It didn't have milk in, obviously. And I think it was cold, so it would have been a pretty disgusting drink.
mm.
But basically like cocoa beans are actually like quite sacred to them, so they used to like trade, instead of money they used to like trade stuff in cocoa beans. um and yeah, chocolate was like a really important aspect of their lives, which before I kind of read about that I had no clue, because
Mm.
you kind of think of chocolate as like a modern invention, but actually like even the Mayans before them were used cocoa beans, at, like kind of had a form of chocolate. It wouldn't be anything like what we think is
Mm.
chocolate, but it was a form of it.
Yeah, I'd be the same as you, and I don't know why I was would think it would be kind of a modern thing because obviously cocoa beans and cocoa plantations would have been around. Um, like I do love a bit of chocolate. I really do. And it was really that kind of grabbed my attention when we were talking before and talking back and forth on Instagram, and you mentioned the Aztecs of the chocolate. So that's why I wanted to kind of bring that back around to kind of find out what that was about. But it does sound like a disgusting drink. But at the same time, vanilla with chocolate is lovely. And like chili and chocolate is a kind of thing that's kind of come around in the last few years. Some people, I don't like it particularly. I think it kind of ruins the chocolate part of it. But whatever people add weird stuff though, like and I'm sure this is a kind of for another podcast with you, Rosie. But food in general and how the changes of our taste buds is amazing, and it's it's weird what we mix now, but we've got so much choice. And back then, they didn't have as much choice, so they kind of just chucked it all in together.
Yeah, and I think with stuff like chocolate, it did come from like colonization.
Mm.
So they kind of stuff like cocoa beans, once it got brought over to Europe as well, I was just like, oh, this is new, like this is really expensive. Let's do something with it. And then they just chuck even more stuff into it
It's
because they could.
it's true. And you see the stuff now, and it's got the popping candy in it, and it's got like jellies in it, and it's just look. I know people have to kind of move on, but it's better than drinking a cold chocolate with vanilla and chili, I guess. Um, this is a kind of question I ask everybody. By the sounds of or from what I'm taking from our conversation, you probably don't get a lot of free time. But what do you like to do in your spare time?
So obviously I like to run my history account and blog. I do like reading. Like I do try and read stuff other than history books because I'm like I need to get a bit, bit of everything in there. I'm not saying I have loads of time for reading though. It's quite hard to fit in. Um, I also have just started playing netball, which is quite random,
Oh,
but I thought it's a good way to go make some new friends and get out of the house. So I joined a local team. Um, but yeah, I mean, I just, yeah, as you said, I don't really have as much
mhm.
free time as I'd like because I work during the day and then I have uni like one evening a week. So it's like, it's difficult to fit everything in, but I try.
Yeah, and I first mentioned netball on the podcast, episode 66. Note that down, people who are ticking off things. Um, why netball?
I think I had like an advert for it or something on like
Right.
Facebook, and I used to play netball in school, and I was like, I wanted to do something like fitness related. I was like, oh, that actually sounds quite fun. And it's like an adults league. Obviously, it's not like
Mm.
kids or anything. So yeah, I just thought, let's go for it, see how it goes."
Yeah, I think it's steady. It's how are you actually at that kind of social aspect where you had to walk into a group? Was that like, do you find that difficult, or are you fine with that kind of thing?
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm generally like quite shy. I
Mm.
just try and like force myself into
Yeah.
not being shy. I've always been shy, like my whole life. I've always been a bit like wary of being like loud and stuff. Like when I don't know people. But yeah, I kind of just like basically like I moved to Surrey like about like a year and a half ago to live with my boyfriend, so I don't know that many people around here. So like since I moved here, I've been like, right, I just go and talk to that person.
Yeah.
I like force myself into it. So like I do find it like nerve wracking, and I
Yeah.
get like a bit like worried. But once I've done it, I'm like, cool, that was good. Like,
It's definitely something that's character building, but the apart from that, just the added social aspect, like you say, especially moving somewhere new, um, to have like a team environment. I did something similar with jujitsu, and I walked into a gym and I didn't know what was going on, and it was that similar kind of terrified. But once I kind of got in there and did a couple of sessions, it was like, oh, that was definitely the right thing to do. And I think that's the way to go. It is hard to push yourself through these things, but definitely worth it in the end. What's the plans going forward for the podcast and the magazine then?
so with the podcast, I've pretty much recorded all my episodes actually, so they'll be coming out like weekly.
Mm,
Um, and then I think once I've finished with the 20s, I think I might move on to like the 30s and the 40s,
good.
like just because I feel like I just want to do something a bit different. So I thought if I move on 10 years and then 10 years, and then I can kind of get different content rather than
Yeah.
just sticking with the 20s the whole time. Um, Yeah, the magazine, I think we're gonna be like announcing edition 3 and like getting article call outs like, well, I mean probably today actually.
Okay.
So like next week will be a lot of stuff going on for it. And yeah, we just had to get started on it because we just want to get it out.
Is it like monthly, the magazine then?
um so I think basically it's 6 editions per year.
Yeah.
Just because it just takes quite a while to put together. So we didn't want to rush ourselves and be like, oh, let's do 12. So maybe next year we'll be like, oh, yeah, 12 is
Yeah.
good.
Listen, when you're running the empire, you can do those kind of things, but you just got to build up to it first. I think the podcast idea is brilliant, by the way, to move forward through the decades. I think that's class because I think everybody has anybody who's into history will have a decade that they're very, very much into. And if you build up, a good following along the way, I think that'd be great because then, everybody say, like for me, it would be the 60s. So I'm waiting for the 60s to come, but I'm getting to know you and the guests that you bring on along the way. I think it's brilliant. So speaking of that, where can people find you then, Rosie?
Yeah, so my Instagram is history with Rosie. I think I am on Twitter, but I don't use it as much. But if you wanted to find me on Twitter, I think it's just history Rosie, because it was too many letters.
Okay.
um, and yeah, the magazine is called the Historians Magazine, so it's just at the Historians Magazine on Instagram. But yeah, I don't really use Facebook as much,
Okay.
purely because there just doesn't seem most people that I talk to on Instagram don't have Facebook accounts. So I thought I saved myself the hassle and
Yeah.
not set up a Facebook page. Um, yeah, just purely because no one else did. So it's like I'll just go with Instagram. That's
Can
the
I
best
can I
way.
tell you about Facebook? It's a waste of time. I've got like 2,400 people following it, the podcast. It reaches about 50 people each post. It's a complete, they just want you to sign up and advertise in it. It's a waste of time. Instagram is better for that kind of thing. Um, if people are looking for the podcast, then is it History with Rosie, the Roaring Twenties?
Yeah, so I just post it on my Instagram, but I
Okay.
think on like podcast, I think it is just History of Rosie Roaring Twenties. I
Yeah,
think that's how I set it up.
I looked it up the other day, and I didn't write it down for some reason, but yeah, I think it's History of Rosie colon, and then it's Roaring Twenties. But like Rosie says, you can find on our Instagram. If you don't want to type in all that stuff, go to the Weekly Instagram, and we follow both Rosie and or the magazine. Sorry, and you can get them both there. So go and do it. If you're into history, go and do it. And if do you know what? If you don't do it, I'll be very disappointed in you. Um, Rosie, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I've very much enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been great. I love chatting about history, so any excuse.
It's all good. I love chatting about history too, and thank you for being the first person to talk about history, like a proper full episode where we talk about history. Rosie, stay with me for 1 minute. I'll finish this out. I just want to take a picture, and then I'll let you get on because I know you're very, very busy. Let's close out the show. Thank you very much to John for all his work this week and his editing of the clip from YouTube, and he had it on time this week. Actually, he had it a day early this week, so there was no telling off. Um, Thanks to the people who helped me to put this together. My mom, my dad, my granddad, Jaron Calvin. YouTube, subscribe if you would. Facebook, a waste of time. I know. If you want to follow us on Facebook too. Instagram is the Weekly Wheatley, where you will find Rosie's content too. Just go into who I'm following and you'll see it. Um, Twitter, also we use that. That's all I have to say on that. So Spotify, Apple Anchor, Google Podcasts, all the other ones that you will find our podcast on. Thank you, Rosie. And thank you to everyone for listening as always. And we'll be back next week. Take care, everyone. Bye.